So, welcome everyone. My name is Michael Blanche Brun. I am MFS Europe's virtual program coordinator. So, today, my job, I'm acting as your virtual host, but I will let Rob do all the talking about battlefield tours. So, I'm very happy you are joining us today, and it's our first battlefield tour of 2025. So, it's the perfect way to start the year off. I hope you had a nice holidays, you feel rested, and you're ready to take on this year. I feel like this is going to be the good one. We say that every year, but anyways. So today, Rob will guide you through Operation Veritable, the first part of the Battle of the Rhineland. If you have any questions considering your Zoom, let me know. And if not, I guess I'll let Rob take it off from here.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Well, good evening, everyone. So, for those who don't know, this is the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War is approaching. And Operation Veritable is the first operation that the first Canadian Army is going to launch in 1945. So, leading up to this battle in 1944, of course, December 16th, the Battle of the Bulge starts and basically puts a pause on a whole bunch of things and throws the Allied forces into a bit of chaos, except for the Canadians, because the Canadians were sitting in the Nijmegen salient, which basically they were from the Atlantic coast near Bergen-op-Zoom all the way to the town of Nijmegen, cutting across through Groesbeek and back down to the Maas River. So we're going to be talking about Operation Veritable. This battle takes place in February of 1945. We're doing it now because we can do Operation Blockbuster, which is the second part of this battle. And this is an interesting battle because this battle itself is so close and it's actually really easy to see for most people. All right, so Military Family Services Europe is not affiliated with any products, companies, apps, or anything named in this presentation, and they are not a sponsor and do not sponsor or endorse anything that I'm talking about when it comes to companies or apps or products. Those are what I use as recommendations to you as an experienced battlefield guide. So what are we going to be talking about? We're going to do a quick overview. We're going to talk about recommended preparations for a battlefield tour. We're going to talk about some travel advisories, visas, security, things you should always be aware of when you're traveling and doing battlefield tours. Some helpful hints. We're going to talk about Operation Veritable as an overview, give you kind of a big picture where we're sitting in the Second World War at this point. We're going to talk about the opening parts of the battle. This is the first time Canada will fight in Germany directly. We're going to talk about them actually crossing the German border, which is quite an unremarkable event, humorously as that might sound, and making it actually to the Rhine River and the end of the battle, which was actually it didn't end on a really high note for Canada. And then we're going to talk about commemorating the fallen of this battle because it's actually a little bit tricky and complicated. So we're going to start this battle actually in the Netherlands in the Gelderland province. It's a population of a little over 2 million people, and of course they speak Dutch, with the main airports being Schiphol and Eindhoven. Which is interesting about Eindhoven Airport is that in the Second World War, it was home to 126 Wing Royal Canadian Air Force as part of 2nd Tactical Air Force, and actually had been attacked New Year's Day, 1945, in a surprise attack as part of the Battle of the Bulge. Gelderland is actually the largest province in the Netherlands and dates back to the Holy Roman Empire as a province, and has a long and storied history of being traded or conquered back and forth throughout its history. The Netherlands is the 9th most expensive country in Europe, so it's a little bit higher than the average to visit. And of course, this battle starts in the Netherlands, in the area liberated by the U.S. 82nd Airborne Division in Operation Market Garden in September 1944, and it ends in Germany. And this is the first time that Canadian units actually fought onto Canadian soil. But there is only one Canadian soldier who was killed in action in Germany that is actually still buried in Germany, and he's in the Reichswald Forest Cemetery. And we're going to talk about him later because he's very unique. So Gelderland has generally a mild climate with cool, wet winters and warm, dry summers. The winter of 1945 is particularly wet and particularly horrid. So this is give you some context. The best time to travel there really is the end of April to the end of October. I have traveled it in wintertime. It is very wet, it is very rainy, and it is very cold. Always, again, dress for the weather, very important. Make sure you have really good footwear, this battlefield in particular, because you're kind of walking on some pretty not great ground. But always dress for the weather. Always travel with travel insurance and medical insurance. You never know. There is hospitals in Nijmegen, there's hospitals in Cleve, but that's kind of it. So if something goes wrong, and you remember that you are going to be crossing an international border. And everywhere is child friendly. Just remember that memorials are exactly that, and they're on people's homes and they're on property, and they need to be respected. It's really important. The nice thing about this battlefield is it was a very quick battle, all things considered, and was very, very well cleaned up post-war. So there's no risk or minimal risk of unexploded stuff and dangerous things, which makes it quite nice to visit. So always use travel advisories. It's important to check out the Netherlands. Of course, there's no COVID restrictions, of course. If you're visiting and doing massive battlefield tours, please remember that you're only allowed 90 days in Europe. Petty crime is a risk in this area, but generally the Netherlands is quite a safe country. As I said, there's 2 hospitals in Nijmegen and 1 in Cleve itself. 112 is the emergency number, and the closest consulate and embassy in the Netherlands is The Hague, and if you're in Germany, it's Dusseldorf. So, Operation Veritable. This is the Operation Veritable map. It's quite a large and complex operation. So, Operational Veritable was the code name for the 1st Canadian Army attack from Nijmegen to clear the west bank of the Rhine in preparation for a crossing of the river. Originally planned to begin the 1st of January 1945, the German attack in the Ardennes on the 16th of December 1944 forced a postponement. The Canadian Army had been holding the line in the Nijmegen area since November of 1944 after the Scheldt campaign, and had spent a miserable winter holding the line, patrolling, and actually building up and preparing for Operation Veritable. And while this was going to be the largest attack ever made by the 1st Canadian Army, it involved a lot of British units. So at this point, the 1st Canadian Army is going to have 350,000 soldiers under its command, which is more than any other Canadian commander has ever had. And it was General, it wasn't Lieutenant General, he got promoted, General Harry Criar, the 1st Canadian Army commander, who was actually in charge of the operation. 2nd Canadian Corps, with the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division and the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, were transferred to British 30 Corps under the command of Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, who was going to be the primary formation attacking in the opening phase of the battle, with its 4 infantry divisions, the 15th Scottish, the 53rd Welsh, the 51st Highland, and the 43rd Wessex divisions. Plus, it had 2 other armored divisions, the Guards Armored and 11th Armored. Attached to it were also a full brigade of specialized armored fighting vehicles, the infamous Funnies of 79th Armored Division, as well as 2 independent tank brigades to support some of the infantry. The battle opened with the largest barrage to occur on the Western Front in the Second World War, with 1,034 guns firing the open barrage. The fire was so intense that at first the British advancing south of the Nijmegen-Cleve Road faced only stunned and shattered defenders. Ranging overhead were the fighter bombers of 8-4 Group, the medium bombers of 2 Group, and 800 heavy bombers of Bomber Command, who struck at Cleve and the town of Gok, flattening them both. The British attacked through the Reichswald forest in terrible muddy conditions. While not flooded like the northern section of the battlefield as we will see, the weather had begun to warm and a thaw had occurred, and the ground went from hard to mud very, very quickly, bogging down all the vehicles and equipment and making movement all but impossible. At 10:30 a.m. on the 8th of February, the ground action began. For the 2nd Canadian Division, it was a small action by the 5th Canadian Brigade's Calgary Highlanders and the Régiment de la Maisonneuve to clear the Nijmegen-Cleve Road near the town of Weiler, Germany, and open it as the main supply route for the 15th Scottish Division, it being one of the very few good roads capable of supporting any heavy traffic. Interestingly, this battle only had 3 paved roads through it. Everything else had to cut through a forest. The Calgary Highlanders ran into trouble right away as they attacked into a minefield and on their way to the town of Vosendal in the Netherlands, but fought through it and turned north and captured Weiler, thus opening the road. The Régiment de Maisonneuve was south of them and had a very successful attack with minimal casualties, taking the town of Den Heuvel in the Netherlands and Hochstrasse in Germany, and cleared the road south to the town of Kranenburg. After this action, the advances of the 15th Scottish and 3rd Canadian Infantry Divisions squeezed out the 2nd Canadian Division, and it was pulled out of the battle, as there is no room for them. This battlefield was only 8 miles wide, and we were attacking with 4 infantry divisions. They were withdrawn and simply transferred back to 2nd Canadian Corps, and we will see them again a little bit later in this battle. The battle opens. The 3rd Canadian Division was the northern flank for this attack, but started their attack 8 hours after the British divisions had attacked from the south. Their task was to clear the Nijmegen Road, between the Nijmegen Road and the river Waal, also the Rhine a little bit farther on, which had been, and this area which they were attacking had been heavily flooded by the Germans when they blew up some of the dikes, including one near the village of Luth, as well as wrecking the dams upstream on the Roer River that had not been taken by the U.S. First Army in the Hürtgen Forest area. So this is a photo here of one is the one on the photo on the left is actually the photo where you can see the breach in the dam, or sorry, the dike, which is starting to flood the area. That's early in January 1945. And the picture beside that is the map showing where it is. And you can actually drive over. When you go there, you can drive over where the breach was. The other interesting thing is the red town that's in the circle, the little town in the circle, that town no longer exists. It was completely destroyed in the war, and nobody ever went back to it. The Canadians, 7th and 8th Canadian Infantry Brigades, began and were starting their 3rd amphibious operation of the war. First one was D-Day, and the second one was Operation Switchback. There was to be minimal tank support because all the roads and fields were completely underwater, up to 3 and 4 feet in places. And so they had to rely on the funny specialist vehicles which were designed with this task exactly in mind. The Buffalo amphibious tractor, Duck amphibious trucks, and Weasel amphibious jeeps were used to carry, rescue, and support the infantry as they slogged through waist to chest deep water. The Regina Rifles jumped off at the town of Beek on the Nijmegen Road and successfully stormed the southern end of the Quarer Dam and took the town of Zeifleck, which was about a mile further east, and they had done so by 8 p.m. The Canadian Scottish's B Company had been tasked to attack the northern end of the dam, but it took until early on the 9th of February, after 3 attempts to take it, did they finally capture the objective. There was a bunker at the end of this dam which no longer exists. The rest of the Canadian Scottish then attacked towards the town of Neil, but A and D companies of the Canadian Scottish ended up fighting in some houses southwest of the town, and thanks to getting lost on some of the featureless battlefield and navigating at night, thus leaving the CO and his headquarters company to move into the still occupied town of Neil, where they were ambushed, killing several men and wounding the CO. At daybreak on the 9th, A&D companies arrived after they figured out where they were and cleared the town. The North Shore Regiment, though, had a very successful attack, capturing the dike west of the village of Zandapol and then clearing the town of Zandapol at 9 p.m. The Régiment de la Chaudière had what can be best described as an interesting time, as they were sitting waiting to clear the town of Luth. The signal for them to go in was missed because the North Shore had communication problems. And so by the time the North Shore Regiment had cleared Zandapol, the message had gotten through, and the Régiment de la Chaudière had to slog through 3 feet of waist 3 feet of water and mud to attack the town of Luth. And they completed their task early on the 9th as well, because they were delayed trying to get down just a simple road. This completed the first phase of Operation Veritable for the Canadians. So these are some very interesting pictures. The picture on the top left corner is the Régiment de la Chaudière actually being rescued by buffaloes. That is the main street as you drive into Luth today. You can see the church on the very top left-hand corner, and that is the same main road, and some of those houses still exist. The buffalo that's in the background has actually fallen into a ditch. And the men, if you actually get a zoomed in photo of this one, the men in the buffalo are remarkably unhappy and kind of scared because they're going to be in 3 feet of cold rushing water. And those are 2 different buffaloes. The picture on the top right corner is from a 4th Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment, which was the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division's anti-aircraft unit, and they were firing in support of the attack. It's something called a pepper pot. It's an interesting design. So, other than the artillery, they decided that they had all these other units that weren't really participating in many battles because there was no real air threat and things like that. So they took all of the anti-aircraft regiments, they took all of the anti-tank regiments, they took any tank regiment that was not doing anything else, and every weapon system they had from the heavy weapons battalions, and they would literally shoot into the German lines as the attacks started to basically suppress the defenders. And so this is the 4th Anti-Aircraft, one of their batteries, firing in support of the attack. It helped provide direction, but it also helped provide suppressing fire onto the Germans. The bottom one is a Buffalo 2 or Mark II. It's moving across the battlefield on the 8th and 9th of February. The crew does not look very dry. It is a very wet vehicle to drive and maneuver around. It would hold about 16 to 18 guys. There was no rear ramp on it, and they would have to jump over the top. But these are the vehicles that were needed to move around this battlefield. That picture there is in the middle of a farm field near the village of Louth. So you can imagine this is a very cold, wet, miserable battlefield. The Rhine River is flooded. They've blown the dikes. When they blew the dams further up on the Rohr River, that water came not rushing down, but they damaged it in such a way that it was a constant and steady flow, and it rose 18 inches in about 2 hours. So it was very, very messy, messy battlefield for the Canadians. So that is the church in the town of Louth on the top left corner. This picture actually comes from that church. There's a memorial just outside of it. And it's got a memorial to the people that fought and died in the area, both American paratroopers, air crew, and infantry soldiers from the Canadians that were fighting there. There's also pictures on maps of the flooding of all the dams. So you can see this is well after the battle because the flooding has gone down. That church still stands, and that church tower still stands, and the house on the corner is still there. In fact, that distance between the house and the church, is now a parking lot where I recommend you park when you stay. The start line for Operation Veritable for the British units is just outside the town of Grozavik. And those who know that Grozavik is also a Canadian war cemetery and a memorial to the missing, which we'll talk about later, this cairn is also the farthest point that 82nd Airborne occupied in Operation Market Garden, and is also the jumping off point for Operation Veritable. The bottom right-hand picture is the North Shore Regiment moving into Nijmegen. So if you look at the picture closely, you'll see a bridge in the background. That's the infamous bridge from the movie A Bridge Too Far that Robert Redford has to paddle across and then storm the other side, and the tanks are going across, and the Germans try to blow it up, and they don't. That's the bridge there. That water pump house in the background still exists. You can actually go to this road and stand right there. There's a lot more trees, but that is in Nijmegen, and this is them about to board their buffaloes to start their attack. The other one is a memorial just outside of Louth to Private Harrison of the Canadian Scottish. He was killed in action on the 27th of January, 1945 on a reconnaissance patrol. And unfortunately, his body was never recovered, but this is roughly where he was killed in action, is this spot. His name is the Grozavik Memorial at Grozavik Cemetery. Phase 2 into Germany. This is an interesting part. As you can see, everything says flooded on the map. It's because it was really underwater. So the picture on this one is interesting to see. That's a Canadian supply convoy driving down the Nijmegen-Cleve Road. You can actually drive down this. It's outside of the town of Kranenburg. And that's what the battlefield looked like for the better part of a month. So Phase 2 continued the push eastward along the Rhine. The North Shore Regiment pushed into the town of Kirkdom, where German resistance eased as the floodwaters continued to rise. Basically, everybody was scrambling to get out of the water and up into houses. And it also cleared minefields, because of course mines don't explode when they're underwater. It's hard to hit them when you're floating over top of them. And most obstacles, of course, were eliminated because they were underwater. The Queen's Own Rifles came forward through them now and took over the advance, capturing the town of Milligan with little difficulty. So they not only did they take Milligan with almost no difficulty and resistance, they ended up having to retreat to the higher levels of the houses and then onto the bank of the Rhine River. And of course, the Germans did not know they captured Milligan, and a German two boats came floating down the river, and the Queen's Own Rifle opened fire on them with every weapon they had and sank them. After Neil was captured by the Canadian Scottish, the Royal Winnipeg Rifles leapfrogged through the Canadian Scottish and captured the town of Kekeen and the customs house on the Alta Rhine, after capturing significant amount of prisoners. The Regina Rifles were the southern flank of the Canadians, and they moved to the capture of the town of Mais. These two actions were some of the first towns captured by the Canadians in Germany. At the end of the second phase, the 7th and 8th Canadian Brigades' tasks in the battle were completed, but one major issue became a serious problem. The rising floodwaters trapped the battalions in their towns, with men scrambling to the upper stories of damaged houses and buildings and dikes, trying to get to safety and out of the freezing cold water. They were trapped until the buffaloes and ducks could be released to come rescue them. So this is a very common thing when you read any account of this battle, is that for the Canadians, they were trying to get out of the water. They were having frostbite and trench foot and lots of wet water casualties because it was just such an awful battlefield. So into Germany, this is the Royal Winnipeg Rifles waiting for their advance on the 9th of February 1945. It's probably one of the most famous photos of the battle. You'll notice most of them are wearing toques under their helmets because it's cold. They're wearing gloves. A lot of them are wearing what's called a leather jerkin. It's a leather jacket that's that's wool lined. Very, very common. It was designed in the First World War to deal with trench warfare, and it was in common use until the 1960s. It was a very, very popular garment. The young infantryman in the center has a shovel on his back. I don't know how much digging they did, but they certainly did carry them with them. Now, this photo here, and there's a series of other photos that come with this series, that's the Regina Rifles in Zeiflich on the 9th of February, 1945. They're actually on a bit of high ground in the town. There are some spots in Zeiflich and a few of these towns that are on raised, the houses are on raised features or dikes. And this is them clearing the weapons that they've captured from the Germans. As you can tell, it's pretty miserable looking battlefield. And the third photo is a crewman who's actually operating one of the buffaloes, and that photo is actually taken near Louth as well. The Chaudière's got a lot of photos in this battle. As you can tell, he's wet and he's tired. They've been operating all night. They're wet. It's been a long, long, long couple of days for them. So making it to the Rhine. The 7th and 8th Canadian Brigades were passed through, and the attack by the 9th Canadian Brigade was delayed until the afternoon of the 10th of February because of all the transport problems. There simply was not enough buffaloes, ducks, and weasels to move all the troops and equipment around. The original plan had called for them to use vehicles to move trucks and tanks, but with the flooding, that became all but impossible. Supporting artillery could also not be brought forward into range because of the flooding. There was no place for the gun pits and the gun positions, and so this brigade would have to attack without a barrage. The Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders met slight opposition, and within an hour of starting, had linked up with the 2nd Gordon Highlanders of the 15th Scottish Division on the Cleve Road at Dunsbruggen. From there, the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders pushed on into the town of Renderen, which took until early morning of the 11th of February, 1945 to clear, with some fierce fighting. North of them, the Highland Light Infantry advanced and were hung up on the town of Duppelward on the 10th due to some German bunkers. But they stormed the town early in the morning of the 11th of February without a loss and pushed to the Spoy Canal, taking the northern half of the west bank. The Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarrys, after finishing clearing the town of Renderen, also moved further east and captured the southern half of the Spoy Canal. A sudden German withdrawal, due to the British taking the city of Cleve, had the Highland Light Infantry and now the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, who replaced the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarrys, crossed the Spoy Canal. Yes, they had to do a canal crossing in a flood zone. So this is one of the worst things that they possibly had to do, because not only could they had to be extra careful, because while they were advancing, some of them on foot, some of them in buffaloes, they had to be careful because of one wrong step and you were at the bottom of the canal. But they commenced their crossing on the 12th of February, quickly capturing Girthhausen, which is back in the Netherlands, Girthhausen by the Highland Infantry, and the town of Kellen with the North Nova Scotia Highlanders without opposition, as the Germans had realized that holding on to these little villages scattered around was pointless when Cleve had fallen. The 7th Brigade had actually been finally rescued on the 11th of February and withdrawn into the Netherlands back to Beek. From there, they moved forward down the Nijmegen Road, through Kranenburg, all the way into the town of Cleve, relieving the British 227th Highland Brigade. The last major attack by the North Nova Scotia Highlanders was the afternoon of the 14th of February. Their mission was to clear the Cleve-Emmerich Road, the Kaufach Canal, and secure the west bank of the Rhine River. They captured the towns of Weyburn and Hundrich with little difficulty, but had a tough fight clearing the actual German riverbank. And their biggest struggle was fire coming from the other side of the river from the Germans. So this is the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders moving off from Mere on the 10th of February to get ready to go for their attack, and there happened to be in a buffalo. Unfortunately, one of their command teams, as they were driving in their buffalo near one of the castles not far from Mere, hit a fence post to the bottom of their buffalo, and it started to sink. And so they actually had to put a ground sheet over top of it and try to rescue it so they can actually get forward. So the center picture is a weasel and a buffalo. The weasel's in the front. The buffalo, or it's not a buffalo, that is a duck. My apologies. Moving down the Nijmegen Road just outside the village of Kranenburg. I've actually driven down this road, and you can too if you drive through the town of Kranenburg itself. And you can see this is a really high water level. This is on the 12th or 13th of February, 1945. So you can just see everything is just awash in water. Trucks would not normally get through this. But saying that, some of the units had to try to move through the Reichswald forest. And the bottom right-hand photo is those Canadian units trying to move down a forest track in the Reichswald, which is a very thick, heavy forest. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's a very much managed forest, but in 1945 it hadn't been managed because, of course, it was on the front line from September until now, and that was being fought through. And there was no paved roads. So basically, there were all these mud tracks that were never designed for this much men, vehicles, and equipment. And interestingly enough, the largest traffic jam of the Second World War happens in this battle. It's about 10 miles long, and it's because a misinformation of a report of a battle or something that had happened in the battle told General Horrocks that he should release his reserve division, which was the 43rd Wessex. And at one point, the 15th Scottish, the 53rd Welsh, who were in the midst of the forest because they couldn't use the forest roads, ended up on the Nijmegen Road. And the 43rd Wessex all ended up on the same road trying to go through, and the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division support trying to get to their guys. So it was 10 miles of traffic jam. It was the longest traffic jam until the Gulf War. The battle ends. The 3rd Canadian Division was pulled out of the flooded area north of the Nijmegen Road and moved to the ruins of the town of Cleve to take over from the 15th Scottish Division, who had had a tough and exhausting fight. And leading was the 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade. It was a pleasant change to be out of the water, but now the battle entered a much messier phase. On the 16th of February, the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, carried in Kangaroos, which are at this point Canadian-built Ram tanks that have their turrets removed, would attack the area near the feature and town of Louisdorf, and the Regina Rifles would attack and clear Moyland Wood, just south of Moyland. And the reason for that is that the British brigade to the north was holding part of it, and then the Royal Winnipeg Rifles would come in and clear inside of the wood itself. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles' attack went well, suffering very few casualties and capturing many prisoners again, proving once again the value of having the infantry transported in their turretless tanks onto their objectives. The Regina Rifles, though, were not successful, as they were hit by fire from an area that they were told had been cleared by the British, just as they started off, and it took all day to clear and secure that area. On the 17th, they renewed their attack again and began their advance, but again, no success thanks to German artillery bursting in the trees and fire from the far side of the Rhine River. The Canadian Scottish Regiment also attacked on the 17th, also coming under heavy fire as they took the high ground overlooking the villages of Hesserfield and Rosenkamp. The 18th of February, 1945, started the 3rd day of fighting inside of Moyland Wood. Now, Moyland Wood is also like the Reichswald. It's one of those manicured state forests. They initially made some progress with the help of some wasp flamethrowers, but heavy fire from the inside of the wood from well-dug-in German paratroopers, plus artillery from across the Rhine, shut them down again. By this time, the Regina rifles in 3 days had suffered 100 casualties. The delay in clearing the wood made it impossible to deploy the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, whose 4th Brigade was waiting in Cleve to come forward and relieve the 7th and keep pushing on. The Canadian Scottish also tried to advance north and get around the southeastern edge of the wood, but their C Company, as they moved, was cut off and all but wiped out, and the rest of the battalion suffering terribly as they moved towards the village of Kalkar, suffering 140 casualties in the 3 days of fighting. The 4th Canadian Brigade forced itself into line beside the 7th Brigade, freeing up the Royal Winnipeg Rifles to help with the clearing of Moyland Wood. On the 21st of February, with the support of tanks from the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, the Royal Winnipeg Rifles stormed into the wood. With their wasps and mounting casualties, they finally were able to clear the Moyland Wood, ending the battle after 5 days of brutal fighting. While this was going on, the 4th Canadian Brigade's attack towards the Goch-Kalkar Road began. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry and the Essex Scottish Regiment, each with 2 companies mounted in kangaroos, a squadron of Sherman tanks from the Fort Garry Horse, began a 2,500-yard drive to their objectives at midday. But soon, all the tanks and kangaroos started to bog down, forcing the infantry to dismount earlier than expected and advance on foot. Adding to the chaos, there was heavy anti-tank gunfire from German positions and mines, which cost 7 kangaroos and many tanks knocked out. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry suffered so many casualties, but it got across the road and to within 200 meters of the 2 fire compounds on the far side. The Essex made their farms by 2 p.m., only to be heavily counterattacked, but they're held on after a grim fight. The Reserve Battalion, the Royal Regiment of Canada, had come up behind the 2 leading units in support, and by 6 p.m., their line was being consolidated, and the tanks of the Fort Garry Horse withdrew, as they often did in the evenings, to rearm, refuel, and repair. At 8 p.m. that same night, the Panzer-Lehr Division and the 116th Panzer Division put in an attack against the 4th Brigade units with tanks and infantry, turning the night into a melee as the Canadians fought desperately to hang on, leading to the Cameron Highlanders of the 6th Brigade to be brought up in support so that the Royal Regiment of Canada could move up and support the hard-pressed Essex Scottish Regiment as they were being overrun. The fight continued all night, and the morning brought forward some more tanks from the Fort Garrys to join the fight, and in a move to help save the men of the Essex Regiment. The losses were absolutely horrific, but there were many acts of bravery, including one Royal Regiment CSM, who was awarded a 2nd bar to his military medal for his bravery, making him the only Canadian to have won the award 3 times in the war. The fighting went on all day on the 20th, but by 8 p.m., the Germans were basically spent, and their attacking force was destroyed. The losses were terrible to both sides, with the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry losing 125 men, the Essex Scottish 204, and the Royal Regiment 64. The Germans lost 11 tanks, 66 anti-tank guns, and 46 prisoners, but nobody knows how many dead and wounded because they just were abandoned on the battlefield and this left there. As these 2 actions took place, the British units captured the city of Goch, ending Operation Veritable. General Criar had decided that this 4-day battle of Operation Veritable that was supposed to get them to the Rhine needed to stop, and a new deliberate operation was needed to clear the west bank of the Rhine, which was to become Operation Blockbuster. Of interesting points of this battle is that the largest smokescreen of the Western Front was also created, and it was generated to hide British and Canadian movements. It started as the attack began, and it was some 2,000 yards long. And by the end of the battle on the 21st, it was 30,000 yards wide of continuous smoke, using some 450,000 gallons of fog oil during the battle to maintain it, which the attacking units all reported it was highly successful. And that smokescreen wasn't just to hide the movements of the troops attacking, but also all the supporting units and things moving around in the background so the Germans on the far side of the bank couldn't interfere. As I mentioned earlier, The heavy use of the pepper pot, which was every weapon available to support the barrage, was used. For the Canadians, this included the machine guns and heavy mortars of the Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa, the towed and self-propelled anti-tank guns of the 3rd Anti-Tank Regiment, the 40mm Bofors guns of the 4th Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment, and the 3.7-inch heavy AA guns of 2nd Canadian Corps' 2nd Heavy Anti-Aircraft Regiment. It was an impressive display of firepower. The ammunition stacked up to support this battle, if it was stacked 5 feet high, would have run for 30 miles. It was 45,000 tons of ammunition. It's an epic amount of firepower used. It was steel, not flesh. So this is part of it. So the attack on the photo on the left is the Regina Regiment about to attack into Moyland Wood. As you can tell, it's a fairly clear area that they're standing and ready to go in their slit trenches, but it's fairly muddy. And the other one is the infantry moving through Moyland Wood. You can appreciate the difficulty of the terrain inside of this wood. It wasn't just a flat wood, it was quite messy. And I mentioned the Kangaroo. The bottom photo is the Royal Winnipeg Rifles aboard their Ram Kangaroo. That's a late model Ram tank. It doesn't have the little turret that the earlier ones that most people associate with it. That's a late model with a bow machine gun and a ball mount. And that's aboard a Ram on the 17th of February, 1945. And these things gave incredible amounts of mobility. The 2 Armored Personnel Carrier Regiments, 1st Canadian Armored Personnel Carrier Regiment and 49th Armored Personnel Carrier Regiment, were heavily used in this battle. And there's many photos of them ferrying and moving infantry forward throughout the entire battle. So, commemorating the fallen. The Canadians that fell in Operation Veritable are mostly commemorated in Grozeby Canadian War Cemetery in the Netherlands, which is back at the start line of the battle. So this is one of the few battles where you actually go see the fallen normally before you actually get into the battle. The fact that there's only one Canadian soldier who's killed in action in Germany is buried there at the Reichswald Forest Cemetery, which is where a lot of the British casualties are. The reason for this is that the 1st Canadian Army Commander, General Harry Criar, had ordered that none of his troops would be buried on enemy soil. And so all of the fallen were hauled off of the battlefield and brought back to the Netherlands. Interestingly enough, Private Marcel Gagné from the Régiment de la Chaudière was killed on the 13th of January, 1945, and was originally buried near Weiler in Germany. And he died during a fighting patrol. The reason why he is there is that he was not recovered until 1948, well after that order had been given, and because he was cleared much later in the battle, or much later in the clearance, he was moved to the Reichswald Forest Cemetery. When you visit the cemetery at Grozeby, you will find Canadians from the time they got into the Nijmegen salient until they were deep into the Netherlands after crossing the Rhine, as well as those that were killed in this battle and Operation Blockbuster. Grozeby also has the Memorial to the Missing for Northwest Europe, for those who were missing after the crossing of the River Seine in September 1944. The cemetery in the middle of the battlefield itself is actually the Reichswald Forest Cemetery, which is an amazing and incredibly beautiful cemetery. It has most of the British fallen from Operation Veritable, as well as about 3,600 aircrew that were concentrated from all over Western Germany. Amongst them, there are 705 Canadian aircrew. There's also a German war cemetery. The German war cemetery is, I'm going to mispronounce this, Kriegsgraberstraat Donsbruggenheide, which has about 2,600 German war dead, which doesn't seem like a lot, but many of the dead were lost and unrecovered in the areas that were flooded and in the forests. And so the Germans, there are some there, and there's also some in the city cemetery at Cleve. But it's a very sad cemetery. It's very much off the beaten track. If you go to visit it, it's very much out of the way. You can find it on Google Maps. It's just outside the town of Dunsbrugge. And it is a very sad place. That's the photo on the left-hand side. It's very much typical of most German cemeteries from the Second World War. They're not as well maintained. They don't get any funding from the German government. It's all by donations and fundraising. And so they are very much not the same. The center photo is Marcel Gagné from the Régiment de la Chaudière. If you see in the background photos, you'll see some Polish graves there. There's about 78 Poles there as well. And he's on the army side of the cemetery. So there's one side that is army troops, which is predominantly British divisions. Actually, it's all British and then Polish ground troops. And the other side is predominantly Royal Air Force casualties, so RCAF, RAAF, Royal New Zealand, Poles, and things like that. But there are several other nationalities as well. Operation Veritable was originally planned as a 4-day operation to clear the southern and western bank of the River Rhine in preparation to cross it. The struggles that British 30 Corps faced in the Reichswald forest and the fighting in the flooded areas south of the river and the sudden thaw that ruined the few roads that existed had the largest traffic jam in history, and all slowed the Allied advance. Operational Veritable was stopped just short of the town of Goch, and a new operation, Operation Blockbuster, which we'll talk about next time, was developed. And at this point is when the 2nd Canadian Corps had a significant role to play in this battle. I hope you enjoyed learning about Operation Veritable.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you so much. I hope everybody enjoyed that. And I'm wondering, do any of you have any questions for now? I'm looking in the chat to see. Oh, Rick has a question. How
Okay.
did the Canadian move the pepper pot, guns, and ammunition? Oh,
So when the initial pepper pot firing was moved in very secretly, actually. They would only move at night. Um, and they were actually shooting from the Grozebeek Heights, so just outside of the town of Grozebeek, the hill slopes down towards the Reichswald. And they moved them in only at night, generally in 3-ton lorries. Um, and it was a slow, long buildup. So the Bofors guns mostly were self-propelled. So they're on a 3-ton truck, and they would literally drive into position, or back into the position, and then they would be in position to fire. And so they would actually move themselves. The heavy anti-aircraft guns were towed by something called a Matador heavy tractor. It was a very, very big heavy-duty truck. They were significantly less mobile, and after the initial pepper pot, they weren't really used because they couldn't really get them down the roads and move through the Reichswald. They were really bogged, so they pushed them aside. And the Cameron Highlanders, their mortars and machine guns were moved in universal carriers, or Bren gun carriers. Interestingly, of all the vehicles that didn't get stuck that easily was the universal carrier. It's a very light vehicle. It was actually the most produced armored vehicle in history. And they would move those forward to every dry spot they could in support of all of the attacks. Now, in the anti-tank guns, the towed anti-tank guns, the 17-pounders, didn't move up as much. It was harder to get them around, but half of 3rd Anti-Tank Regiment was towed 17-pounder guns. They're big monster anti-tank guns. But the other half were self-propelled, and the Canadians had just adopted a vehicle called the Archer to complement what M10 tank destroyers, which is an American one that they'd used. And so they actually drove them into position, and they would just literally pull them off into the spot, and they would start shooting from wherever they could get dry ground. And so for the self-propelled units, they were moving themselves forward as best as they could. Through the forest was a bit of a challenge, but some of them were actually dragged. So there's a couple of photos of ducks and buffaloes and some of the armored vehicles dragging other vehicles through the water because, of course, their engines would get swamped down the Cleve Nijmegen Road. So today, if you follow the road from Nijmegen out, it's kind of just before you get to the Nijmegen Bridge, you can follow that road all the way down the battlefield. Don't take the 9, which is the new section of the 9, which is bypasses all those villages. But you can literally drive that road and see how it's flooded. And there's some really great now and then photos of the town of Kranenburg. I showed a couple where you can see these vehicles driving through 2 and 3 feet of water as it was flooding. If Kranenburg got less flooded than the rest, so it's usually about 2 feet outside the villages, which worse. And self-propelled units would drive themselves, and everything else if it was heavy and towed, could not come forward. And they struggled to get everything through until the floodwaters started to recede at the end of February.
thanks,
And for the
Rob.
ammunition, it was moved in ducks because they would carry 2.5 tons worth of stores, and they're amphibious trucks. So if they needed to float, they would float. If they could drive, they would drive on their wheels. So that's how they would actually end up resupplying a lot of these people, was through these amphibious vehicles, because they couldn't do it any other way.
Huh. Rick says, great info, thanks. Yeah, I wasn't expecting that. And also, next question. Canadians moved around using specialty vehicles. How did the Germans move around flooded areas in reinforcing and withdrawals?
So the Germans,
Question.
if they could withdraw, were using boats. Yeah, so we didn't. The Canadians didn't use as many boats. There were some later on in the battle. The Army Service Corps and the engineers did some pontoon type boats to try to drive around. They weren't very effective. The Germans used boats, or the Germans didn't withdraw until we crossed the Spoy Canal. They usually overrun, and after the Spoy Canal, it was all by boats. And then as soon as they could get to dry ground, they pulled back. So most of the time, the Germans either got overrun, but the big pullback after the Spoy Canal crossing, they all used boats to get out of the wet zone and whatever boats, because the Germans only had really one amphibious vehicle. It's called a Schwimmwagen. There wasn't that many built. I have no photos of them in the battlefield being used, and the divisions in place that were fighting, so the 84th German 84th Infantry Division didn't have any, as far as I can tell, and nor did the German Paratroop Division 6th Fallschirmjäger Division, which came in to behind to backstop them. Specifically at the Moyland Wood, where there wasn't any flooding, they just fell back on foot. But yeah, it was mostly by boat or they swam. So the Germans had actually tried to get across the Rhine River after the North Nova Scotia Highlanders. They tried to swim the Rhine to try to get to safety. They were remarkably unsuccessful.
All right. Well, if you liked this session, we will have a next session next month.
It's the
This is a
11th
great
of
discussion, I
February.
think. Yes, exactly. The 11th of February, so same time, 7 p.m. Berlin, to wherever you are. So it's the same time. And Rob, do you want to give them a little glimpse of what it's going to be, or?
Absolutely. So we're going to move. Operation Veritable is finished. We're now going to be moving into Operation Blockbuster. So this is the second half of the battle for the Rhineland, and it's the big push to clear the banks of the Rhine to get ready for the literal invasion of the Ruhr and the industrial heartland with the crossing of the Rhine in March of 1945. So we're going to talk about Operation Blockbuster next, and then in March we're going to talk about Operation Varsity and Plunder, which is the third part in this series of the battles to get into Germany.
Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for your time tonight, and thank you for coming out. You'll be able to join us monthly. We're going to be running this for pretty much the rest of the year, and hopefully we see you again. And thank you so much, Rob. Thank you for your time as well, and thank you for your passion. It's really nice to see it through, to see the history through your eyes. It's nice.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, have a good night, everyone.
Good
Tschüss.
night, everyone.